The last time anyone saw Betty Lee alive, she was talking on a telephone. The next day, her body was found in the New Mexico desert. The forensic evidence revealed there were two perpetrators who left the scene and drove off into the desert. A discarded cell phone revealed why. These 25,000 square miles of high desert are called the Four Corners, where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. It's home to America's largest Native American population, including the Navajo, Hopi, Ute, and the Jicarilla Apaches. There is some violent crime in these parts, but not a lot. So it was a surprise in June of 2000 when an electrical worker saw blood on a remote stretch of road. A short distance away, in the bushes, was the body of a young woman.
It was quite obvious when I saw the body that we had a homicide. And a very brutal one at that.
A knife and a sledgehammer were found in the brush nearby. The victim was identified as 36-year-old Betty Lee from Shiprock, New Mexico, about 30 miles away. Betty was a Native American, a Navajo, divorced with 5 children. She had been going to school to become a nurse.
My Aunt Betty was a very happy person. She loved everything about life. I mean, her kids were her number one priority, and then school. And that was why she was back in school, was to make life better for them.
2 years earlier, another Native American, Donald Sosi, was found stabbed and beaten to death in the desert just 10 miles away. Police feared a serial killer might be on the loose. At Betty Lee's autopsy, the medical examiner found numerous stab wounds to her chest, as well as blunt force trauma to the head.
Death would be quick, not necessarily instantaneous, but it would be quickly.
It appeared that the sledgehammer and knife found near her body were the murder weapons. There were no signs of sexual assault. Toxicology tests showed some alcohol in her system, but not a lot.
She had some alcohol on board, but wouldn't necessarily be so impaired that she couldn't defend herself or do something else.
The alcohol was a potential lead. A quick check of the local bars indicated Betty Lee spent her last night in a place called the Turnaround. She was with 2 of her friends, Tina and Gloria. According to witnesses, there were 2 men drinking with them.
One was named Johnny Miller. And the second guy, we never learned his first name. However, his last name was Pretty Boy.
Eventually, the 2 men asked 2 of the women if they wanted to continue the party somewhere else.
Gloria and Tina decided to leave the bar with Johnny Miller and Pretty Boy and go to a motel room. And at this time, it made Betty Lee almost the third wheel.
Witnesses said Betty pleaded with her friends not to leave since she didn't have a ride home. But the foursome left anyway in a red pickup truck.
They say that Betty Lee was chasing after Johnny Miller's red dually pickup and screaming at him and begging him not to leave her at the bar.
From there, she walked to a convenience store and used the payphone.
Betty called the Shiprock Dispatch Center, where she asked the dispatcher to contact her brother, who's a Navajo Nation police officer.
But her call didn't go through. A witness said she hung up the phone and cried. When the witness looked again, Betty was gone. Investigators wanted to know what happened from the time she made that telephone call to when she was murdered in the desert. While investigating the murder of Betty Lee, police searched for two women who were with Betty the night before at the Turnaround Bar and had left with the two men. Police were able to corroborate their alibis. The foursome had checked into a nearby motel where they had remained until morning. Investigators hoped forensic evidence at Betty Lee's murder scene would point them in the right direction.
I had been on some homicide cases prior to this. At this point in time, this was the most extensive and the most horrific I had seen.
After dusting both the sledgehammer and the knife, there were no fingerprints on either one. So that was a dead end. Not far from Betty Lee's body were some tire tracks and some shoe impressions. Both were revealing. The shoe impressions told investigators there were two killers. One wore men's boots, size 13. The other wore Converse brand basketball shoes, size 10. The third set of shoe prints were the victim's sandals. The tire impressions near the body were the size found on a car, not a truck. Yet, there were 3 different tires.
I've not seen a vehicle with 3 kinds of treads like that before. It's the only one I've ever seen. May happen, but I haven't seen it.
The 3 different tire impressions led away from the crime scene, down the road a short distance, then turned off, heading into the desert.
I wanted to find out where them tracks are leading, why were they out there, because at times you might have more than one crime scene too. There's always that possibility there might have been another crime scene out there.
Police decided to follow the tracks, having no idea where they would lead. The trail went on and on, deeper and deeper into the desert.
At times we noticed that the tracks crisscrossed each other, so we'd have to take time and figure out what direction we wanted to go because they overlapped each other.
We weren't even 100% positive that this was a vehicle that was directly related to this homicide. We were just following tracks that led out of the crime scene.
At times it was difficult to decipher.
Where are these tracks leading? Why are they here? Over the next 3 or 4 hours, we followed tracks, and when we lost them, we'd get out, walk, look for them, pick them up again, drive some more till we lost them again.
And this went on for mile after mile after mile. And then the trail stopped. Nearby were tire impressions from several different vehicles. Apparently there had been some sort of meeting.
was obvious. The vegetation had been tore up. There was ruts in there. The sand was tore up. And then I started picking up several different shoe impressions. One was a smooth sole, might have been a Western boot.
About 20 yards away, they found another extraordinary piece of evidence. A cell phone.
I've lived in the area my entire life. That's something that's very uncommon, is coming across cell phones out in the middle of nowhere.
The cell phone looked fresh. I mean, there was no dust on it. There was no rain spatter compared to the bottles and trash that was in the area.
Was it possible that the cell phone belonged to the killer? From the phone company, police identified its owner as a tow truck driver, Charlie Bergen.
I got a call from the sheriff's department asking me why my cell phone was laying near this dead body, you know, out there in the middle of nowhere. You think, oh my gosh, I'm going to be arrested for murder.
Bergen insisted he knew nothing about any murder, but he said he could explain the 4 sets of tire tracks in the sand. According to Bergen, a car got stuck in the sand the night before. The owner called his father, who arrived in a pickup truck, and the pickup truck got stuck too. They called for a tow truck, and it got stuck. Finally, the tow truck driver called Charlie Bergen, and he pulled them all out.
I've been doing this a long time, 17 years of it, and you see people do some really stupid things. People have weird ways. It's none of my business what they do. I just go on and towed them out and did my thing.
Investigators could hardly believe it. But what was Bergen's phone doing in the sand?
While I was pulling them out, my phone rings. Cell phone reception here is not very good. Couldn't hear a word she was saying. It was my wife. Kind of pisses me off. So I just throw the phone away. No big deal.
Investigators were now faced with a dilemma. Either Charlie Bergen had just told one of the biggest lies they'd ever heard, or he had come face to face with Betty Lee's killers. "36-year-old Betty Lee, the single mother of 5 young children, had been murdered in the New Mexico desert. The tire tracks found at the crime scene led police on a journey several miles into the desert, where apparently the vehicle got stuck. Charlie Bergen, a tow truck driver, told police he was called to the scene to pull the vehicles from the sand and was paid for his services with a check. It was signed by 31-year-old Bobby Fry, a construction worker who had a police record.
He seemed nervous in a kind of a weird way. Not really nervous, just didn't want us in the vehicle, I guess you could say. I don't know why he didn't want us in that vehicle. I don't understand that.
Bergen said Bobby Fry was driving the car.
We're headed off to Bobby Fry's house. This is something that needs immediate attention. If there's any evidence, we need to get to his house and preserve it if there is any.
When questioned about the incident, Bobby Fry confirmed that his car got stuck in the desert and that he called his father to help pull him out. But he denied having anything to do with Betty Lee's murder. And he willingly allowed police to search his home.
remember walking into Robert Fry's bedroom and thinking, oh my gosh, there was an enormous pile of clothes. There was stuff scattered everywhere. The room was in total disarray. And I remember thinking, I have to go through this entire room with a fine-tooth comb.
In the pile of clothes, investigators found a black T-shirt and a pair of size 13 boots, the same size as the impressions found at the crime scene. Bobby Fry said his friend Les Ang was with him the night before. In Ang's home, police confiscated his clothes and a pair of Converse brand basketball shoes, size 10, the same size as the impression found at the crime scene. The clothing and the murder weapons, the knife and sledgehammer, went to Rod Englert, an expert in blood spatter analysis. He examined Bobby Fry's shirt. Under enhanced lighting, Englert noticed tiny blood droplets. The size and shape indicated medium impact blood spatter. He found the same size and shape blood droplets on Bobby Fry's boots. To Englert, this told a story.
Consistent with him being the one that had the sledgehammer and hitting Betty Lee with it as she lay on the ground.
There were no fingerprints on either the sledgehammer and the knife who would tell us who was actually handling the sledgehammer or who was handling the knife.
But Rod Englert found another way to prove who was handling the sledgehammer. Under a microscope, Englert discovered tiny traces of sand and blood deeply embedded in the shoulder of Bobby Fry's shirt. Englert said there was only one way this could have happened.
And that is consistent with placing the sledgehammer and the handle over one's shoulder with the sand and the blood and carrying that 10-pound weight on the shoulder. That is my opinion as to what occurred after she was hit with the sledgehammer. That one casually walks off carrying the hammer on the shoulder.
As for Les Ang, there was no blood whatsoever on his clothing and no blood spatter on his shoes. But there was a blood transfer pattern. It looked as if Les Ang carried Betty Lee's body into the brush, but he wasn't nearby when she was killed.
So you're able to eliminate and exclude by the evidence the participation of Leslie Ng in the killing of Betty Lee.
DNA testing of the blood on Bobby Fry's clothing and shoes and Les Ang's shoes confirmed that it was Betty Lee's blood.
We found Betty Lee's blood in the vehicle itself. And in fact, we found an earring, or the police found an earring in Robert Fry's vehicle that matched up to the earring Betty Lee's body had after she was murdered.
And finally, the tire impressions found at the crime scene matched the tires on Bobby Fry's car. Bobby Fry and Les Ang were both arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But investigators still didn't understand the motive. When confronted with the overwhelming amount of forensic evidence, Bobby Fry denied he was involved, but Les Ang confessed. On the night of the murder, Betty Lee found herself without a ride home when her friends left the bar with two men. And she wasn't able to find anyone to give her a ride home. According to Les Ang, Bobby Fry was angry that night. He had gotten into a bar fight earlier and was looking for trouble. That's when they saw Betty Lee crying near the payphone. Both men carried Betty's body into the bushes, creating the blood transfer pattern on Les Ang's shoes. The two left the murder weapons at the scene, along with their shoe and tire prints. Their trail led into the desert, where they planned to do some joyriding. But they ran into trouble. In a colossal blunder, Fry's car got stuck in the sand. He called his father, who also got stuck. They called a tow truck, and it got stuck too. Ultimately, it was Charlie Bergen who got them out. Had it not been for Charlie Bergen's cell phone that he threw in anger when his wife called while he was pulling the cars out of the sand, police might never have solved the case.
You know, when I got that call that day from my wife, I thought, oh, God, what does she want this time? You know, just called me up to bug me all the time. But it was probably the best phone call I'd ever got in my life.
Robert Fry was tried and convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Les Ang testified against him and received a 40-year sentence. Bobby Fry was later convicted of 3 other murders, including that of Donald Sosi, the Native American whose body was discovered 2 years earlier, just 10 miles away from where Betty Lee was murdered. Betty Lee's family members are grateful for the work of law enforcement and the forensic evidence that identified her killers.
We really appreciate their efforts in bringing justice to her murder.
Betty Lee did not deserve to die, and no one deserves to die in such a horrible, terrifying manner. This was one of the worst situations you can even imagine for a woman's last moments on earth. It's horrible.
A memorial now sits on the site of Betty Lee's murder, a reminder not only of a life senselessly lost, but the scientific investigation that put her killers behind bars.
The evidence at the scene, as well as the evidence we recovered on follow-up, made the difference in this case. The physical evidence is always the most important factor in the trial process if it's available. Physical evidence doesn't lie.
Forensic science was huge. The way everything from the blood spatter interpretation, the DNA, the footwear evidence, the tire evidence. It was huge. Forensic evidence solved this case.